Welcome back to the Everything Financial Radio Show here on the Legacy Radio Network. We are chatting today with Mr. Karl Denninger. Karl writes a blog that can be found, I believe, Karl, correct me if I'm wrong, at market-ticker.org.
That is correct.
And I always enjoy reading he must sit at his computer and read and write and research all day because he's a prolific writer. Karl, you probably, I'm sure, saw the article. One of the publications I enjoy reading is the Telegraph. And the Telegraph recently ran an article that was rather optimistic about the global economy. It was titled Global Slump Risk Falls as World Money Rebounds. And the article talked about the first green shoots are now visible because real M1, the money supply, has picked up after a drastic slowdown. And that kind of refers back to something that you talked about in the last segment, and that is that credit is contracting, and yet the Telegraph article seems to be reporting something that's a bit contradictory to that. What's your take?
I go back to you have to look at the sum of both credit and money aggregates. Yes, M1 is expanding. That's what central banks do. They try to get that out there. But you have to look at the total aggregate in the economy. And this is one of the problems that you run into when you start trying to analyze this kind of thing. For example, in the United States, we just had the Consumer Credit Report that was issued. And other than student loans, which are expanding, that's under non-revolving credit, but fortunately it's broken out in a way that we can separate it out. There's been essentially no growth in consumer credit. It's been flat on its back, and it's still not apparent. Well, if people are not borrowing and they're also not seeing wage increases, where is the economic growth going to come from? Because at the end of the day, everything comes down to final demand. Does it not? Someone must buy all of these goods and services that are produced. So if you don't make additional money, your wages don't go up. And you look at the wage and hour reports every month. We get the employment report. It has the average hourly wage and the average work week, and that is not increasing at any material rate. And then you don't have an increase in credit. Well, what's buying the goods and services? Okay, and this is the problem that we see here. And then I look at things like, for example, the Taiwanese trade report numbers that came out a couple of days ago. They showed a dramatic slowdown, and most of that trade is going into China. So you can't trust anything that comes out of China's headline numbers because they're all manipulated. It's all government based, and there's no private independent verification of anything. But you can look at what's going on here in the United States. With it, as long as you pay attention to where the actual analytical moves are coming from, you'll see that the only place that we've seen credit expansion over the last 4 years has been in the government. Well, if government borrowing is just a shift from one person to another, you can only get that money from one of two places. You can either tax it from someone, in which case they can't spend it in the private economy, or the government can continue to issue more and more debt, which means that every unit of currency and credit that's in the current system becomes devalued and it buys less. Well, both end up in the same place. You haven't actually stimulated the economy. The error that's made in counting these things is that deficit spending has to be subtracted back off of GDP in order to be able to actually figure out where you are from an economics point of view. But this is, of course, not done.
Karl, I read your blog entry about the Taiwanese export numbers, and seems that is not an isolated report. That seems to be the case all around the world, and we seem to be entering into a situation not unlike the collapse in world trade that we saw in the early 30s. Are you seeing some parallels there in your view?
Yeah, there's a real problem here. We have another parallel in 1873, the Long Depression. And we were, to some extent, China. If you look for parallels there, and that we were the exporter, and Europe was the importer. But our particular export, our commodity, was of course grains and other farm products. And when they went into a severe downturn, a slump, a depression, if you will, we had a huge problem because our economy was gross export based. There was a monetization issue. We demonetized silver. There were, and the railroads collapsed. And they had been financed through issuing long-term debt that couldn't be rolled. and then all of a sudden nobody wanted to own it at anything close to the coupon that it was paying, and you had the same kind of bond market dislocation that is now starting to happen over in Europe. Okay, so we've got some parallels there too. What I'm seeing with the Chinese slowdown is quite dramatic and quite apparent. You're also seeing the end of the manufacturing exploitation that has taken place over in China over the last 15, 20 years as we've exported all of our manufacturing there, and companies like Foxconn have been set up to take advantage of this, but that's all they're doing is essentially taking advantage of the idea that you can get cheap labor and pollute the environment, and that's how you can manage to manufacture things at a much lower cost. Now you're getting the beginnings of civilian revolt in China against these policies. And so what is Foxconn doing? They're looking to open factories in Indonesia. Well, it's like a field of locusts. They come in, they strip all the ears of corn, and then when it's all gone, they go to the next place and do it again. This is not a stable economic model. We need to have an honest conversation, both in this country and everywhere else, about how we stop doing this, because this sort of destructive, credit-fed boom always leads to a bust. And we are on the cusp, I believe, of being forced to recognize some of these economic facts. Nobody wants to deal with them because they're extraordinarily difficult, especially when you start talking about the impact on government policy. But if we don't deal with these things in an upfront fashion, they're going to be forced down our throat, and that's worse.
Karl, I want to talk a little bit about some of the regulation and some of the new laws. And there was an article in which McDonald's Corporation and Papa John's Pizza CEO talked about the costs of Obamacare and talking about the drag that this will be on the economy. John Shatter, who's the CEO of Papa John's, said that Obamacare will add 15 to 20 cents to each order, each average order. So he says, I'm going to pass those costs on to consumers. I have to. McDonald's, the fast food restaurant, said that it will cost between $10,000 and $30,000 per store to comply with Obamacare. So assuming this is implemented, and I see no way that it's completely rescinded, what will be the effect of Obamacare on the economy and hopes for a recovery?
Well, it's going to destroy any hopes for a recovery. But then again, the real problem isn't Obamacare. The real problem is the medical system that we've built in this country that is essentially entirely predicated on the premise that medical providers are somehow special and therefore they're entitled to screw people. We allow them to, the entire medical industry, not just one part, but the whole thing from top to bottom, we allow that industry to engage in practices that would be punished as felonies in virtually every other line of business. For example, they can collude on price. They can cost shift intentionally by forcing you to pay for somebody else's treatment when you're under duress. Okay, so that's essentially equivalent to holding you up. If you're having a heart attack, you're hardly in a position to negotiate your cost. Okay, they can take the cost of someone else who is funded by the government and end up shoving that down your throat. They can even force you to pay for an illegal immigrant's medical care because they provide that, and then when they can't collect on it, they add that to your bill. All of this is hidden from you. You cannot get transparency. You can't get any kind of agreement. There is no contract for service that you can sign before you go in and say, okay, this is exactly how much it will cost. And Obamacare has taken the few places where that is being done. There is a surgical center in Oklahoma. There's a handful of others. And has gone out and made those particular installations that have tried to bypass this illegal. It's very interesting to note what's actually happened if you look at places like that. That particular center, on average, you will spend 1/5 to have a procedure done there of what you would be billed in any other hospital in this country. The difference is they only take money. Okay, so when you think about this, where are all of these embedded costs and embedded scams? Is it terrible that you would have to come up with, $3,000 or $4,000 to have something fixed if you had going for surgery? Sure, but you can find a way to fund $3,000 or $4,000. Most families can't fund $20,000, $30,000, and that's where or for that matter, $100,000. Okay, and that's where these problems are coming from. But Obamacare doesn't solve any of this. It institutionalizes it, makes it permanent, and makes it worse. And it is going to put at least 1 million people out of work in this country.
Karl, the time we have left, and we've got almost 4 minutes left, you wrote on your blog about a primary election result in Michigan, where I happen to live, and I believe I'm pronouncing this correctly, I believe it's Carrie Bentavolio.
That is correct.
Kerry Bentivolio won a primary against a lady by the name of Nancy Cassius. You were a big supporter of Bentivolio, and it's a pretty interesting primary result, and it seems like there's still maybe even more voter unrest than there was during the last election. Can you fill our listeners in and give us your opinion?
Yeah, Kerry Bentivolio, that entire race came about to a large degree because McCotter failed to file sufficient valid signatures to qualify for the ballot. So all of a sudden he found himself off the ballot, whether we liked it or not. Kerry was running against him before that happened, and the Michigan Republican establishment had an absolute conniption over the idea that McCotter was gone and they weren't going to get their thing. Okay, so now what they tried to do was run a write-in candidate, Nancy Cassius, and Ms. Cassius, to her detriment, was one of the sponsors and hard pushers of the Michigan business tax. Well, this was, for somebody who's a conservative, supposed to be for smaller government, less taxes. Well, what are you doing sponsoring legislation that raises taxes on people? Right? She tried to hide from this. She published a number of things in campaign literature and materials that I believe were outright slanderous regarding what Mr. Bentivolio stood for and believed in. And yesterday, the people went to the polls and said, okay, enough of this nonsense. Kerry is our man for this district on the Republican ticket, and Nancy can go home. Good for them. Now, the problem and the question is, come November, are we actually going to see people get voted out based upon what they've done? And that's the question that we actually have to see some validation on this, because the problem we had in 2008, if you remember, with 300-1 phone calls into Congress during the TARP debate said, do not pass that bill. Congress passed it anyway, a couple of weeks in front of the election, and 90+% of the representatives in the House were given their jobs back after going directly against the will of the people less than a month ahead of the election. That's outrageous, and yet that's what happened. The only way we will ever see a solution to any of these problems and an honest discussion of the deficit, debt, and the medical system, which is where these things are coming from. If you don't fix the medical system, you cannot solve the deficit at a federal level. There is no way around this. This is arithmetic. It doesn't have anything to do with politics. Is if the people who have continually lied to the American public are thrown out. And that, that Kerry is, at least at this point, now he's won the primary. Now, of course, he has to win the general election in November. But assuming we actually see some people get shown the door, maybe there is hope.
Carl, always a pleasure to chat with you. Again, the website to read Carl's work is market-ticker.org. Carl, thanks for joining us today.
Anytime. Thank you very much.
All right, Everything Financial Radio on the Legacy Radio Network will return after these words. Stay with us.